This is a special educational event where our panel will discuss the critical role of visibility in dynamic supply chain operations and, of course, provide some case study examples that detail the challenges, solutions, and results that transportation professionals can learn from on their way to improve decision-making. Now, my name is Michael Levins, and I'm Group Editorial Director for Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, which, of course, includes Logistics Management Magazine, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session that's being brought to you by our friends at Lean Logistics. Now, I think everyone joining us today is well aware that logistics and supply chain management operations play a more critical role in a company's success than they ever have in the past. And that dynamic, and the more dynamic your supply chain operations are, the better positioned your company is going to be to compete in our technology-rich, consumer-centric business environment that we're all facing. Now, today, not only does supply chain management encompass the planning and management of all activities involved in sourcing, procurement, and logistics activities, but it includes coordination and collaboration with channel partners, including suppliers, intermediaries, third-party service providers, and, of course, those all-important customers. Now, the concept sounds simple enough in theory, but add in this new era of permanent business volatility to the mix, and the modern-day supply chain becomes that much more challenging. Now, in order to continue grabbing opportunities and leveraging market conditions, shippers really need dynamic supply chains that go beyond just planning, producing, and delivering the goods on time. Well, on the way to creating this new dynamic supply chain, more logistics and supply chain professionals are implementing visibility tools that connect them with real-time, accurate inventory, order, and shipment information that's necessary for both inbound and outbound freight networks. Now, by integrating these solutions, shippers, customers, and business partners all benefit from real-time data, reporting, and the alerts that come with it. And with supply chains becoming increasingly global in nature, the requirement for such high levels of visibility and the technology that supports such capabilities is only going to increase over the coming years. Well, today we've gathered a terrific panel that's going to help shed more light on the importance of improved visibility in your logistics and supply chain operations and discuss the areas that will have the most impact will be most impacted on once visibility is achieved. Now, joining us today to help us put more context around the improved visibility discussion are Zakiya Morgan, John Hameling, and Melissa Gannett. Now, Zakiya has spent the last 15 years working in a variety of strategic, operational, and tactical roles within the supply chain management field. As a logistics manager, she manages a highly variable supply chain within the Managed Transportation Services Group at Lean Logistics. She's working with supply chains in multiple industries, such as Hostess Brands and American Hotel Register. Now, John is an account manager for Managed Transportation Services at Lean Logistics. He has more than 25 years in the transportation industry, including fleet ownership, transportation procurement, and 3PL operations, and management including both asset and brokerage operations, and he's working with brands across multiple verticals as well, such as Rich Products and Tower Automotive. And Melissa is responsible for the overall implementation and logistics execution of Managed Transportation Services at Lean Logistics. For the past 17 years, Melissa has worked in a variety of supply chain functions, ranging from tactical operations to strategic software implementations, working with many top food and beverage supply chains, such as Dean Foods. Now, a fine welcome to everyone today. Now, before we get started, we're just going to take a quick look at the agenda. And as I mentioned, our panel is going to be touching on those areas that visibility is most needed, and then we're going to share how success in those areas all roll up to best practices and continuous improvement in logistics operations. Of course, the team's going to touch on operational efficiency. Now, that's that critical area it's about building the foundation for your supply chain operations. We're also going to be touching on service, and that's where we're going to take that foundation and apply visibility to service where we can more effectively care for those all-important customers. And, of course, cost. As we all know, visibility to cost is paramount and is the end goal of all the work that's being done in operations and service. Now, as a quick reminder, we're going to have a short Q&A session following our broader presentation today. So please make sure to submit your questions to our panelists while we're going through the presentation. We're going to get to as many of those questions as possible while we're here with you today live. But if we don't get to your question, we're going to capture all the questions and move them over to the panel, and they'll be able to get back to you via email. And of course, following the webcast, you can join the visibility conversation at any time on Twitter through the hashtag @DynamicVisibility. You'll see that down at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Now it's time to get started. Now we're going to start off with Melissa. Melissa, you've worked with a number of supply chains and have seen how efficiency in operations really sets the foundation for the rest of the supply chain. Can you tell us what areas should practitioners consider in terms of the impact that visibility can have in operations, and maybe share an example of what you've seen in the past?
Absolutely. Thank you so much today, Mike. One of the biggest impacts that I have actually seen over the many years that I've been doing this is really the ability to scale an ever-changing supply chain. As we all know, supply chains can rapidly change from year over year, and there has to be an ability to effectively and efficiently scale those supply chains. I had the pleasure recently of helping implement a very large food and beverage shipper who had a very decentralized network. And this can go both ways. Both centralized and decentralized models can work under this visibility. This particular shipper, though, did have a decentralized network, and they knew that they were missing opportunities and leaving money on the table, and really were unclear of where those dollars were being spent and how ultimately to control that bottom dollar and to stem the flow of bleeding that they were seeing in certain areas. Well, once they became a shipper who decided that they needed visibility, we were able to really look at the data that they supplied and knew that a solution that gave them good visibility could ultimately provide them with some regional synergies to move forward and establish a standardized process on one consistent platform, and was able to be implemented fairly quickly. If you look at it, we were able to, in a little over 8 months, bring about 65 business units up onto one platform and one standardized process with as little as 5 coordinators assisting in that process. So a very quick turnaround for them to gain visibility holistically over their network and to really see where they were spending those dollars. The visibility then also allowed us to kind of leverage what the volumes were across all the resources that we had employed to manage this transportation, and we're able to replicate that process and bring up additional business units as we move forward. This helps us obviously this time of year with seasonal production swings, and really giving us the benefit of maintaining that bottom dollar, knowing what the visibility from last year had predicted. We can replicate then this year and to mitigate that cost really going into this holiday season. Technology and visibility also allows us to be agile in that ever-changing market and really manage those exceptions that we know occur in that supply chain. As we all know, in transportation and in the supply chain world, things will always happen, and there's got to be a way to be able to be proactive and not reactive. We were able to document what those exceptions were and then provide that intimate financial detail back to the shipper to give them what the cost impact of such exceptions were and how in the future to eliminate or at least minimize that impact. One such exception that I've dealt with is actually I worked with a food manufacturer who produced mayonnaise, and as strange as that sounds, mayonnaise has a volatile instability at extreme cold temperatures. So as we went into the winter months, we noticed that if there was an extended period of time it was moving on the rail, that mayonnaise would separate. Actually, the oil would proceed to the top of the jar and definitely not be a sellable item in the marketplace afterwards. Well, in looking at that, we determined there's got to be a way for us to at least understand what the impact of that seasonal cold swing would be. And we made the choice then based on our forecasting to change that mode of transportation and deal with that exception from the rail to a truckload. And then we can actually look at what the cost associated with that change was and actually use that in budgeting for the next year's budget. So really the visibility is probably one of the largest impacts that a shipper can do to look at their network holistically, not in silos, and really enable a broader view of the network and the possibility of streamlining processes in dealing with those exceptions.
No, absolutely, absolutely. The food example is just terrific there, and it does also work across so many different industries as well when you have to be nimble, and now that visibility offers those capabilities. Now, Zakia, we're going to bring you into the conversation a little bit. Zakia, like Melissa, I know that you've worked across different verticals in CPG and wholesale as well, which are two very different models, with similar challenges. Now, having seen these various supply chain models, what is it that you've seen on the operations side? And maybe what is something that you've seen a shipper do that really stood out as a best practice coming from achieving that deep visibility capability?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. The example that I'm going to give you today is we have actually had the pleasure of working with a major CPG brand that had limited resources and a significant change to their supply chain. Through the visibility of their network, they were able to make data-driven decisions as their supply chain network evolved. As they also increased their efficiencies at their facilities, this allowed the company to actually reduce one of their operating facilities while maintaining their transportation costs and ultimately reducing their overall supply chain spend. And they were able to do that by looking at what the cost was from a transportation perspective and then comparing that against what the operating costs were at that particular facility. So it gave them a really good view of, making the decision, making sure there was data behind it, so they knew and they were confident in the decision to go ahead and close that facility down to reduce their supply chain spend. Mm-hmm. The next piece is really from an integration. This helps both the customer as well as the carrier, and I want to talk a little bit about the customer level. You're getting real-time data that flows between the supplier and the customer and the carrier partners very fluidly, concise. Everybody's seeing the same exact information. So communication is increased. Accurate information doesn't have to be repeated. It also decreases the manual manipulation and the human error and labor overhead from actually both the customer and the carrier level. But from the customer level, that information just can feed in through integration with limited resources to allow them to really concentrate on the business and other areas in that customer service level and having that communication with their customers. And then the next really is from a carrier perspective of that integration. We're just hearing so much about, being the shipper of choice. How do we become the shipper of choice? We know that capacity constraints that are at an all-time high right now. So if we're able to reduce the carriers from having to provide updates through email and phone calls, which can be tedious at times and very lengthy from a process and resource standpoint, we can actually get that information through integration where they're updating their system and it automatically feeds into the technology for, once again, the supplier, the customer, the carrier, the planners, all different parties being able to see that information. It allows as the drivers also can enter information into their different technology platforms that automatically feeds into their system. So really reducing their their overhead and their labor resources to actually be able to then concentrate on, driver retention, making sure that drivers are on time for their appointments and actually securing those carriers or those drivers for those loads. The next is just the ease of execution, and it once again kind of applies to the shipper of choice here. From the tendering process through settlement, carriers have an understanding of what the expectations are of them through the tenders and what they're going to get paid, how much they're going to get paid, and really ultimately when they're going to get paid. Did I get paid? Do I have payment coming? So that's where the ease of execution from a technology and visibility standpoint comes from a carrier. And then from a customer, they have visibility to rate analysis and communication, routing guides, and can really take a look at how things are being rated and where their money is going and how it's being spent. So it's really all about just building better supply chains together.
Absolutely. I love that example. The shipper of choice, that's a term we beat upon quite a bit here at Logistics Management, and that visibility is going to help shippers, open up that line of communication with the carriers. It's a two-way street now in this world of tighter capacity. Now, John, we're going to engage you now. John, let's turn to you for a second and bring you in on the service side of the conversation. As I was reading your bio a little earlier, it seems like you've sat in just about every chair there is from a supply chain perspective. Now service is such a critical element in today's supply chain, and given market conditions, we haven't heard the last of service delays and capacity constraints, of course. That's going to be one of the number one concerns moving into the next couple of years, especially as the economy continues to keep ticking up. Now, how should a shipper be looking at service, and how can they find their own set of best practices once they have improved visibility in place and established in their operations?
Yeah, those are great questions, and you're right. Service will continue to be an area of focus for many shippers for a long, long time. It has been in the past, and it will continue to be. But with visibility being brought into the equation using a TMS platform, what that allows now is for the partners, the business partners in the supply chain, to be able to go in and see status updates of any given shipment at any part of that shipment from start to finish. It gives them real-time information to knowing what's going on. And what's really cool about that is, at times, we've all heard this, where a buyer of a particular product might have a misguided perception of service that's being performed by any given carrier or any given customer selling them product, and using the terms like, you guys are always late, you guys are poor on-time performance providers. But with the visibility through the supply chain and having all of that data available to them, what you can do is take that information, present back to that buyer who's buying the product the reality of what the service actually is. And oftentimes, more oftentimes than not, what you're able to do is change that misguided perception into the buyer knowing exactly what they got. And I've seen cases, in fact, where the change was so great in that buyer that when they compared it to some of their other vendors supplying them products, they found that the person they thought was providing poor performance of on-time delivery or on-time service was actually better than some of their other performance. And even to the point where one particular customer of our customer buys a lot of product, $17 million worth of product on an annual basis, and it's a pretty important account for them. And what I've seen is, they leverage things like service as part of the negotiation. But if you take that out of the equation, then it gets down to buying the product for what it's worth, and I've seen it where that's actually helped them by giving them the right service information, that it doesn't become part of the decision-making process. It takes it off the table, and that's allows them to even win the business at times.
Absolutely. Those are great examples. And let's turn back to Sakia. Sakia, I believe from a service perspective, to tack on to John's examples there, I believe you have an interesting story to share on how one shipper that didn't focus on their carrier service, but rather focused on the ways they were making an impact on their carrier, again, trying to be more of that carrier of choice, that shipper of choice, and realizing it really is a two-way street. Can you share that story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we know visibility allows both the customer and the supplier to see the same order request, status on fulfillment of the order, and any potential delays or issues can be easily communicated to all parties. And I think John kind of just touched on that a little bit as well. The example I have is we had a customer that had a lot of small partials, LTL shipments that were shipping cross-country. So it did help the carrier from a service, but also an on-time performance was affected as well, because as we know, when we're shipping small shipments across country with LTL providers or more of a partial, so they're picking up and stopping at other stops along the way, there just increases the potential risk for delays as well as the opportunity for increased damages. So we took a look. at this particular customer holistically through the visibility of the technology, was able to look at an area on one side of the country that had a very dense supplier network within a close proximity of one of their DCs that they actually operated. And so they were able to take a look at these small partial LTL shipment supplier freight and actually start looking at pooling that into the operating DC location. What that allowed them to do is actually have a singular driver make those runs in and out just to pull that supplier freight, multiple pickups. It's short distance, so it's easier to recover to get that product in. And then we created full truckloads out of that facility that we were able to ship across country to the other DCs. It eliminated empty miles, reduced underutilized equipment. It also decreased the number of trucks bumping to those DCs that were smaller DCs. It eliminated some of the labor costs at those DCs as well. And ultimately, it reduced their transportation, their inbound transportation spend by 2%. And in addition to, obviously, the cost benefit, which is always definitely a benefit in what shippers are looking to do, it created capacity at these DC levels, because if you think about it, we need that. Capacity is so tight. So it allowed us to do round trips back to the other DC. It also allowed to have that capacity of those DCs to then ultimately ship to the final customer end user as well. So with the capacity constraints in the marketplace today, this is extremely important for customers to be able to do.
Absolutely, that's a great example. And anybody out in our attending today who's concerned about capacity, just to hear that great example there, and to create your own capacity, that's got to open up a lot of eyes, I'm sure. Now, Melissa, after hearing this story, in your estimation, what best practice do you feel is bred from gaining this service of visibility?
Well, as both Zakia and John alluded to earlier, obviously with visibility in the supply chain, really suppliers and shippers can be proactive and not reactive. When they have access to either real-time data or have historical data at their fingertips, they can make some really good business decisions. I worked with a major private label manufacturer of pickles, and really they use this data to really do some seasonal forecasting. So probably unknown to most, there is a pickle season. Unfortunately, it runs when most produce does, so it runs on typically the end of the spring all the way through the beginning of the fall. So during that time, as we well know, the capacity is extremely tight, especially down in the south. And most shippers don't look ahead far enough to know that the produce is going to directly impact their business and really align their capacity for that time of the year. And really most budgets are not padded enough to pay that top dollar in that last hour for those carriers to take their loads. What we've seen is that during this pickle season, the shippers' customers were not getting shipments on time, so there was definitely some concern from their perspective is how are we going to manage this? How are we going to improve this year over year? Well, looking at that, they have decided that they implemented actually a drop trailer program. Previously, they had been mostly a live-loaded operation, which, as we know, production and weather play into a big part of a facility's operation when you're talking of production. And they were spending a lot of extra dollars on either truck order not used, detention, or if carriers didn't show up, then they would have product sitting on their dock, which had definitely an expiration date as well on there. So by looking year over year at their data, they were able to then submit a really smooth drop trailer operation, and really that has streamlined their process to the point that they're rolling it out across their networks and other seasonal areas. And now they can actually maintain the customers that they have. Customers are getting their product on time and definitely place their orders with confidence that they know that they're going to get what they ordered when they ordered it, and really can execute those loads either at the budget that they are anticipating, and maintaining that customer level of security and appreciation for the job that they've done. So really, I found over the years that customers who know that the shippers they're working with have good visibility over their supply chain, really have a handle on what their business looks like and really what they can expect in service.
Right, and it gives them that flexibility, again, that cuts across just every market. You mentioned a terrific example there. Again, talk about seasonality, the pickle season, who knew? But, it cuts across so many different markets in the seasonality, and it gives you that flexibility, which I think, when we're talking about the dynamic supply chain, it all boils down to that visibility portion of this. That's terrific, Melissa. Now we come to cost, right? So which is probably where most shippers actually, begin when they start thinking about continuous improvement, right? They tend to start with questions like, hey, how can we drive down our costs, or, what is our cost to serve X, Y, or Z customer? And that's where they usually start. But in reality, and John, I think we're discussing here is how you build your foundation, set your service expectations, and then look at performance metrics to really drive best practices. John, would you agree with that? How does that roll out?
You bet. That's exactly correct. I mean, by using a TMS platform, again, to have your transportation running through a network, now what you have is the ability to go in and see any given metric you want to look at to identify a trend, how something is performing. You can look at your cost per mile, your cost per case, your cost per cube, on-time performance, on-time pickup could be part of that, carrier give-backs, and what costs are implied from all of those different things. Really what it is taking all of that data and then setting up dashboards to allow you to keep a pulse on any part of the business that's going to affect your costs, and then look at those trends and apply solutions to help correct them, turn them around, fix them, improve them any way you'd like to. So what it really does is just gives you the ability to understand where you're spending your money and the ability to put some fixes to it.
So then we'll also take a look at the bleeder lanes, and I think Melissa actually touched on those bleeders as well earlier in the discussion, but this is really important to us from a visibility standpoint and a correction and ultimately cost. So we internally have created a report that allows us to take a look at the lanes in which the primary carrier actually didn't accept it, and then what the cost impact was to ultimately have a different provider service that lane. And then we can take a look at that, and we actually do by priority where the greatest opportunity is. So what the cost impact, how many times did it move with the primary carrier, and then it allows us to action that. So have a discussion with the carrier. What's the reasoning behind not taking this lane? Why are we paying a premium? Those type of questions. A lot of times you'd be surprised at the answers you get back. Sometimes it's not, I just don't have capacity. There's been times in which I've heard back, the customer it has long detention times, or I struggle to get appointments, so I don't want to take the time to accept it and deal with it. So those are things internally as a company, as a shipper, you can actually action, address, correct, and then get your primary carrier actually back on that lane and reducing your overall costs. So identifying your carriers and how they're impacting costs, and creating that report to really give some visibility around where your opportunities are to decrease costs and actually increase service, because if you have that consistency there on that carrier, you're typically receiving better service overall as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, Melissa, let's have you finish up on the cost side. It's all important cost side. Now, we've discussed a number of different examples, but let's talk about how you've seen shippers approach costs and how they're looked at from a continuous improvement standpoint. Can you give us some tips there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as John and Zakia both have mentioned, data-driven dashboards really play a big, important part in a lot of shippers, and actually their employees can actually measure what they're doing, how they're doing it, and where those pitfalls may be and how to eliminate them, and really show all the facets of the transportation and the costs associated with it. One such data extract really provided a good insight to a current customer that I've worked with that really brought their operation onto one platform. However, they still manage their operations in a facility-based environment. So each facility was kind of driving their own businesses forward and really didn't know what their partner down the street, maybe 40 miles, was actually doing. So you would have instances where you were having both shippers or both facilities actually shipping LTL orders to the same destination location, essentially in the same lane. This had a huge impact when you start looking at the footprints of drivers and capacity, and how much utilization was being thrown out the window, per se, in the efforts for not being able to consolidate or talking with the person down the street. So really, by looking at their data, they were finding these opportunities, and this was not something that they originally even identified. So this was potential savings that they had no idea that was out there, and really they are now on the bandwagon with this and really working together and having synergies across their network, and really are on track right now to utilize these truckloads, and really are on track to save approximately $2 million annually, like I said, that they had no idea that they were missing out on. Another opportunity really is in accessorials. So accessorials are really a kind of a black hole, if you will, in the carrier market. So not a lot of process has been put around, maintaining accessorial costs, and what are you spending, and where are my dollars being spent, and how can I really eliminate it? So this shipper actually looked at their data, looked at the accessorial spend, and really started putting parameters around what they were doing and how they were reimbursing carriers, and really making sure that the money was being spent appropriately and the carriers were being actually compensated appropriately. So with this, they've literally have seen in the past 5 months a 3% savings on just visibility into their accessorials and putting processes and procedures around accessorial charges. So really, for most shippers, these are cost savings that they can actually employ day one that most do not recognize are out there.
Right, another terrific. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? With those kind of cost savings, and that's going to open up a lot more eyes here as we're wrapping up. And guys, just a terrific job. The panel, you guys have done a wonderful job of exploring the areas that are most affected from improved visibility. Of course, operational efficiency, service, and cost. And I love the examples of shippers that have been able to use those metrics, to make those smarter, data-driven decisions in their logistics operations. And the other portion I really liked hearing was, how this improved transportation visibility, leads to the development of a truly dynamic, flexible supply chain, something that today's savvy organizations are using as a key differentiating element, no matter what industry they're in. They're using it as a key differentiator in how they position themselves in any market that they're practicing in. And as Mark Pearson, a columnist for Logistics Management, recently wrote in our pages, he said, moving from the integrated to dynamic supply chain model really enables companies to view their supply chains as adaptable ecosystems of processes, people, capital assets, technology, and data. Now, they strive for flexibility and visibility where it matters and focus their efforts on operational agility that drives profits and not just short-term efficiencies. Now, it takes many, many steps to get to this ideal dynamic supply chain that Mark's referring to. And we really hope that today's presentation will help push attendees to re-examine their own operations and current technology capabilities, and then take those necessary steps to improve the visibility that they're going to absolutely need to stay competitive. Now, we're going to move on to a quick Q&A session, guys, and we have a number of questions coming in from the floor, and we do have a few minutes left, and I just want to let all the attendees know that we are gathering the questions as they roll in, so please keep submitting them. We have time for a couple questions right now, but if we don't get to your question today, we're going to be packaging that up and shooting it off to our panel. I believe the first question, John, I think this is for you. It says here, John mentioned battling perceptions on performance. This gentleman's challenge is educating the executives that don't understand supply chain. Does data alone help here, or is there more that you would advise we use in making that case to our executive team?
Yeah, I think that data, the real data, sets the sets the stage. It gives them a reality of what's going on. But then taking that data and presenting it in a way that says, here's what we're doing to fix maybe an issue out there. So doing something with the data along with presenting the data would certainly help educate them.
Right, absolutely. And that's a challenge that so many of our readers are facing right now. That's great advice. Another question that just came in from the floor. This one looks like it might be for Melissa. Let's see. We feel the pinch from produce season as well, like the example you shared, but we aren't involved in produce. So how do you get visibility to capacity or impacts to capacity that are outside of our own business? That's a great question, Melissa. How would you tackle that one?
Well, and absolutely, even if you are not in the market of produce, I think as a supply chain in general, every facet of transportation, supply chain, manufacturing will feel the pinch somewhere along the lines of that produce season around the country. And you know, any time spent within this industry, we all know kind of the swings in geographic locations of what that season looks like. So really knowing really the flow of that season and knowing your capacity is going to tighten up. If you look at your historical data, you can easily see the trends in your own data that show the driving cost, and usually it's on an upward spike, you know, typically starting, you know, second quarter of your year. And you can really tell where that produce is. So going through that exercise and really looking at your data will help you to forecast and plan and really discuss with your carrier base some competitive rates, and knowing that they may decide to leave you at the time of produce season, but really offering them good steady volume and freight, and understanding that you are a shipper of choice for them and that they can stay with you through that. You can also use this data, you know, as you're going out through your procurement events in the year, and really you can put your volumes against the monthly averages that you see out there, and really let those carriers know, you know, when you're expecting your own spikes in your own seasons to help hopefully mitigate that cost associated with the produce season.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. Guys, unfortunately, we are up against against the clock right now. We do have to wrap up. We want to thank everybody for attending. And again, we do have a number of questions that have rolled in here during the course of our presentation today. So we're going to gather all those questions and move them over to Zakiya, John, and Melissa, and those guys will get back to you via email. Again, don't forget, too, to join the conversation on Twitter at Dynamic Visibility. That conversation is going to continue on now following after this terrific presentation. Again, I want to thank everybody for attending, and a special thank you to our terrific panel, Zakiya, John, and Melissa. Guys, a wonderful job today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You bet.